I'm Johannes, co-founder at ruumi. In this video, I'll explain how and why we certify sustainable grazing and how this can help you implement a grazing system with low inputs and high sustainable outputs. Livestock farmers use ruumi as a daily companion to manage their grazing in a sustainable way. We have more than 400 farmers today using our app. So our goal is to help you transition from the picture that's here on the top, where there's a farmer who is doing set stock grazing. He has to use a lot of fertilizer, to the system at the bottom, where we help you with satellite-based insights to optimize rotational grazing, increase your natural productivity, increase biodiversity, and so on. And our app is free to use. So if you haven't signed up yet, go ahead and do that now. By using ruumi for grazing management, you're building a rich data set of your grazing activity. And this data we can use to certify your land management and create really high value carbon credits, which could be a new revenue stream for you or a way to finance the investments needed to sustainable management. Let's talk about carbon credits and how that's different from carbon accounting. You may have actually already done carbon accounting, where you quantify all your greenhouse gas emissions of your farm for a given year, maybe using the tool like the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So at the end, you'll get a single number like 230 tons of CO2 equivalent is what your emissions were in the last year. Carbon credits, on the other hand, are a tradable certificate that represents the right to emit 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So as you see, it's a right, and it's something that you can transfer to someone else, meaning you can trade it, you can sell it. And those certificates, they are created through different types of methodologies. But let's talk a bit more about carbon credits and how they are created. The first thing we need to do is we need to establish a baseline. The baseline means that those are the emissions that you would have now and going forward if you just continue managing your land as you have in the last 5 years. The second thing we do is we figure out how you're managing your land today, what you can change, and what that would mean for your emissions going forward. Right, so here this line where it says project, that would maybe be the improvements that we can achieve. And then we take the difference in the moment where we verify between the project emissions and the baseline that we established at the beginning of the projects and generate carbon credits. So to summarize, we don't just do carbon accounting at one point in time. We actually forecast your business as usual emissions going forward in time, which is then used as a base for creating your carbon credits. So without a baseline, you can't have any carbon credits. So you can see that the number of carbon credits that you can earn is very much dependent on your baseline and on the improvements that you can make. So if you already have a very high baseline, there won't be many carbon credits for you to create. So every farm will be different. But to give you an idea, we think that for a 100 hectare farm, you can earn between 5,000 and 10,000 pounds worth of carbon credits per year. All right, now you have carbon credits. What do you do with them? Well, you can keep them until you think maybe the government requires you to be carbon neutral, or you can sell them today. I think this is the right time to talk about the different types of carbon markets. There are 2 types of carbon offsetting markets. There's the compliance market, where mostly governments and companies set themselves mandatory targets for how many emissions they want to reduce. The characteristics here for this market are it's really large. More than 99% of all credits are traded here. It's also very slow and very heavily regulated. You as farmers, you don't actually have to reach any targets yet, right? You don't participate in this compliance market. Examples for this market are the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, where countries agreed on achieving certain goals, and the EU emissions trading system. On the voluntary market, on the other hand, there are mostly companies who set themselves voluntary targets for reducing emissions. So this market is relatively small in comparison to the compliance market. It's very quick to change. There's essentially no regulations, but there's also a lot of innovation happen, especially when it comes to solutions like carbon farming. But the fact that there are no regulations is not necessarily a good thing. It means that there are some bad actors who create certificates with very low quality that don't actually remove any CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's why there are certification standards which are supposed to give buyers some security. The most well-known certification bodies are the Verified Carbon Standard by Verra and the Gold Standard. There are also other standards like the ISO 14064, but we don't think that they meet the quality criteria of most buyers. And we wanted to make sure that the standard we go with will actually give you the access to the most buyers and achieve you the highest price. We think that Verra Methodology 42, the methodology for improved agricultural land management, is just that. It accounts for the most serious greenhouse gas emissions for your livestock farms. There are 3 different types of gases from a number of sources included in this methodology. First gas is carbon dioxide. And for that we have 2 sources. One is soil organic carbon. Obviously that should be a sink because you should be able to increase the organic carbon in your soil throughout this project. And your fossil fuel use is also included, which means, for example, the diesel that you put in your tractor. You should be able to reduce that if you, for example, increase the grazing days in a year, because then you don't have to cut as much silage and hay, meaning you use your tractor less. The second gas is methane. Here we're including enteric fermentation, so from the digestion of your livestock, and manure deposition when your animals graze. Those 2 will probably not change much during this project if your livestock stays the same. And in fact, the productivity of your farm cannot decrease by more than 5% throughout this project to ensure food security. The last gas is nitrous oxide. Here we're including the sources nitrogen fertilizer, nitrogen fixing species, and manure deposition. We think we can help you to completely eliminate the need for nitrogen fertilizers, and we help you introduce the right type of grass mix, for example with nitrogen fixing clover. I've spoken before about the quality of certificates, and here I want to mention 2 very important criteria for quality. The first one is additionality and the second one permanence. Additionality means greenhouse gas emission reductions are additional if they would not have occurred without the use of carbon credits. Put differently, someone who buys your carbon credits should be financing your transition towards sustainable grazing and therefore reduce carbon emissions. If any practices are common practice, meaning everyone is doing it, or they're mandated by law, that actually also would not count as additional practices. The second important criterion is permanence. It's so important because a carbon credit is the right for someone to put a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. So whoever removed that ton should have done so permanently. Otherwise, the improvement is only short-lived and we're not actually solving this climate crisis. Permanence is also kind of relative, right? So even the best carbon removal methodologies where the carbon is put hundreds of meters deep into geological deposits, they only estimate permanence at 1,000 years and not forever. Obviously in farming the timeframes are much shorter, and so that means that also the risk of reversal is higher. To account for this potential of reversal, for example, by changing farming practices back to how they were before, we have to have a non-permanence buffer according to this methodology. So this buffer absorbs the risk of some fields or some farmers not having permanent reductions. And to maximize permanence, we choose farmers who are committed to long-term improvements and will benefit from the change to a low-input, high sustainable output system the most, because then the risk of that farmer reversing their practices is very low. And with that in mind, we estimate that permanence for these credits is somewhere between 50 and 100 years. The last thing missing is how do we actually carry out a project? First thing we need to do, as I mentioned, is to create a baseline for your farm. That means we will quantify all the greenhouse gas emissions and pools. We measure soil organic carbon, we collect data about your fertilizer and fuel usage, for example by collecting your receipts, and then we forecast what will happen if farming activities would stay the same. We will also forecast potential improvements, and we come up with a plan for what you can improve. And then we implement. You'll use the ruumi grazing app to get satellite-based insights to track your animal movements, balance supply and demand, and maximize your grazing days. And we can also use this data to make sure that you're on track and help to improve over time. And finally, we come to the verification. Once again, we quantify all greenhouse gas emissions and pools, we do soil sampling, and then we issue certificates. And those certificates, they are yours to decide what to do with. You can keep them for as long as you want. For example, if you think that the government will at some point in the future require you to be carbon neutral, and then you could keep those carbon credits to later offset your own emissions. We think that could be risky because we don't know yet whether the government will actually allow these types of certificates or what they will require from you. You can also sell them to whoever you want at some point, which will most likely be at the end of the verification period, so in a couple of years. But we think that the risks of these carbon credits are pretty high for a single farmer. So on the one side you have risks of policy changes, and on the other side you have risks of the project execution itself. There are risks in, for example, in reversal, and there are risks in the estimation of how many carbon credits you think you'll actually be able to generate. Even a single field not performing as you thought it would could make a big difference. So we think it's smart to actually group up because that way we can share the risk. And grouping up here means that you would commit some or all of your certificates to the ruumi portfolio. Because teaming up means more farmers, that is a lower risk for carbon credit buyers. Why? Because the risk that all farmers will not hit their goals at the same time is very low. And that means we can actually forward sell these certificates, which means for you that you can get paid every year. And if we team up, ruumi can also take the risk of non-permanence and of policy changes. But in both cases, we would charge a 15% issuance fee. There's no upfront cost to you, meaning that you will always make a profit. So there's no reason really for you to not draw a line in the sand today and get your baseline established. Sign up for the ruumi app if you haven't done so already, and let us know when you're ready to get started. All right, thank you for listening. I hope you found this informative, and if you have any questions at all, just write an email.